the foggy world of medieval intoxication. Hey friends, tonight we're setting aside the textbooks and stepping into something a little more fragrant, a little foggy, and way more herbal. We're diving into the curious, sometimes hilarious, occasionally terrifying world of medieval intoxication. Yes, they did it. A lot. But not the way you might think. Now, before we dive headfirst into flying ointments and questionable teas, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy the weird rabbit holes. We go down here. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I love seeing how far this little community stretches across the world. All right, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that medieval tavern white noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey. It's tempting to imagine the Middle Ages as one long mud-soaked montage of monk's plagues and unseasoned turnips. But peel back the rough wool and chronic despair, and you'll find something else, people. Real flawed, experimental people who sometimes stared at a weird-looking root and said, I wonder what happens if I mash this up with hot wine. And honestly, can you blame them? There was no Netflix, no espresso shots, no modern medicine. Your daily entertainment was watching a knight try to read aloud or speculating how long your neighbor could keep dancing before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone whispered that a mushroom could help you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you'd probably give it a chew too. Contrary to our assumptions, the idea of using substances to alter perception wasn't rare or underground. It was actually baked right into the culture. They just didn't call it getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind haystacks. Instead, these states of mind were described with phrases like divine inspiration, sacred trance, or pain remedy. Doctors used herbs, monks grew them. Witches, depending on who you asked, applied them. And pretty much everyone encountered these plants at some point, whether by medicine, by ritual, or by accidentally eating moldy bread that made you see God in your goat. And let's be clear, the medieval medicine cabinet wasn't just limited to a warm tankard of ale, though that certainly helped. They had roots that whispered seeds that seduced the senses, and flowers that blurred reality. Some herbs were smoked, some brewed. Others were smeared on skin with the same enthusiasm as a toddler with finger paint, and many of these concoctions had effects that went well beyond relaxing. But here's the kicker. This wasn't always for recreation. Sometimes it was about relief, sometimes it was spiritual, and sometimes it was just plain poor decision-making on an empty stomach. Depending on your social rank, your mind-altering herb might have come from a barber, a monk, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf, who learned everything he knows from a squirrel that lives in a sacred log. No, I'm not kidding. In the medieval world, you didn't need a velvet-roped lounge or a shady dealer. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a wildly experimental attitude toward dosage. Nature was the dealer, and she did not come with instructions. Medieval Europe was absolutely brimming with natural intoxicants, plants, fungi roots, resins. Some could cure a toothache. Others could make you think your soup was reciting Latin poetry. The line between medicine and mysticism was blurred so thoroughly it was practically decorative. Physicians, monks, midwives, and herbalists all had their own special blends, some based on science, others on superstition, and a few based entirely on, Grandma says, this works. Don't ask questions. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of playing Russian roulette with your brain. If prepared correctly, it could soothe pain and lull you into sleep. If not, it could send you sprinting through the woods, convinced you're a duck with a royal destiny. Henbane was one of the MVPs of the medieval pharmacy, known to botanists as Hyoscyamus niger and to everyone else as that stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was being chased by bees made of fire. It was used all over Europe. It dulled pain, treated insomnia, and in unfortunate dosages caused vivid hallucinations, convulsions, and dramatic soliloquies to turnips. And here's what made it wild. It was legal. There were no medieval drug enforcement agencies. But the church definitely raised an eyebrow or 12. Because if your vision came from henbane, not heaven, you were either blessed, cursed, or in desperate need of an exorcist. Still, that didn't stop people from loving this stuff. It was brewed into teas, smoked in pipes, and rubbed into the skin with animal fat for a smoother, slipperier mind trip. Because why swallow a weird root when you can rub it into your armpits and hallucinate your ancestors arguing in French? And if you thought henbane was the weirdest botanical celebrity of the era, let me introduce you to mandrake. The mandrake root was the drama queen of the medieval garden. Shaped vaguely like a stubby little person, it came with legends that were pure nightmare fuel. People believed that if you yanked it from the ground, it would scream like literally emit a noise so loud it could kill you. That didn't stop folks from harvesting it. They just got creative. The go-to technique: tie the root to a dog's step back and let Fido do the digging. If the scream killed anyone, it'd be the dog, not you. Ethical? Absolutely not. But effective. Mandrake wasn't just folklore. When used carefully, it worked as a sedative and anesthetic. Boil it in wine, and it dulled pain. Sniff its fumes, and you might get a vivid dream or a conversation with your ancestors. Used incorrectly, and, well, you'd have a really good story for St. Peter. Monks wrote about mandrake and their herbals with a little too much enthusiasm. Herbalists wore dried mandrake like charms, and people believed the root could boost fertility, bring prophetic dreams, or protect against demons. It was the Swiss Army knife of weird plants. But of course, the church was less thrilled. Anything that caused hallucinations and wasn't directly sponsored by a saint was automatically suspicious. But even so, mandrake was too useful to completely outlaw. So it lingered in apothecaries tucked between more respectable herbs like lavender and chamomile. And if that's not enough weird plant drama for one night, just wait until we talk about belladonna, a plant so pretty, so deadly, and so embedded in medieval culture that it was basically the botanical version of a toxic X. Belladonna ointments and how to fly. Maybe. All right, welcome back to our medieval deep dive into herbs that either healed you or had you passionately confessing to crimes you didn't commit. Where were we? Ah yes, belladonna. Let's talk about this infamous femme fatale of the medieval garden, also known as Atropa belladonna, or more bluntly, deadly nightshade. That's right, it literally has deadly in the name. If your beauty routine includes something labeled like a final boss in a fantasy RPG, maybe reconsider. Or not if you were a noblewoman in the 1300s. It was basically the medieval version of contouring. The name belladonna means beautiful lady, and it got that label for a very specific reason. When a few drops of its extract were added to the eyes, it made pupils dilate. And back then, wide pupils were considered alluring, like I see the divine in your face, kind of alluring. The catch: it also made your vision blurry, increased light sensitivity, and sometimes made you bump into furniture like a possessed Roomba. But hey, beauty standards have always required a bit of suffering, right? Now, belladonna wasn't just for vanity. It had plenty of practical, or let's say experimental uses. It was applied as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a sort of truth serum. Although truth might include hallucinated conversations with saints' ancestors or wallpaper that won't stop breathing. What makes belladonna dangerous, besides the obvious, is that it contains atropine and scopolamine alkaloids that interfere with the nervous system. That might sound fancy and chemical and modern, but medieval folks didn't need a lab report to understand what belladonna did. They knew it worked, just not always in the way they hoped. And get this, belladonna was a major player in one of the most notorious forms of medieval transportation. Let's talk flying ointments. Yes, flying. You know those old stories of witches riding broomsticks through the night sky? There's some awkward truth rooted in those tales, and it has everything to do with this slippery, toxic paste. These ointments were often made from a base of animal fat, sometimes pig, sometimes goat, sometimes cat. If you really wanted to push the drama and were infused with herbs like henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and occasionally datura, another heavy hitter we'll get to later, these were not recreational spa day blends. These were mind-altering concoctions designed to transport the soul, or at least make you forget about your chores for a while. Now these ointments weren't ingested. They were applied topically, usually to areas of the body with mucous membranes for faster absorption. That's right. We're talking inner thighs, armpits, and yes, genital areas. This was not Grandma's chest rub. And here's where the broomstick comes in. According to several historical sources, not just legends, but inquisitor records, the broomstick wasn't just a symbol of witchcraft. It was a literal applicator, a staff, if you will, anointed for transportation. In short, the broom handle was smeared with flying ointment and applied accordingly. Not exactly kid-friendly content, but effective at least from the user's perspective. After a few minutes, hallucinations, visions, sensations of soaring over rooftops, feasts with the devil, dancing with animals, flying through the night sky, and of course, waking up in a barn naked clutching a turnip with no idea what year it is. Now, whether these experiences were real is beside the point. For the people having them, they felt real. And in a world where mysticism, medicine, and madness lived side by side, visions weren't dismissed. They were interpreted. Were you touched by the divine, cursed by demons, or just really good at herbology? That depended on who you told. Back in the monasteries and apothecaries, herbal brews and salves were also a lot more subtle, but no less potent. Take poppy extract, for example. Yes, poppies, the same source of opium. Long before modern pharmaceuticals figured out how to bottle pain relief, medieval folks were mixing poppy sap with spiced wine or honeyed broth. It was strong enough to numb you during surgery, but delicate enough to be served by candlelight. These concoctions were considered medicine, but they came with side effects that weren't exactly listed on a scroll. You might see angels. You might talk to your own reflection. You might believe your teeth were made of glass. The range was vast. And then there were the traveling potion sellers, those charming medieval snake oil merchants who would roll into town with bottles of elixir that claimed to cure everything from heartbreak to bubonic plague. The ingredients, often a mystery. Could be wine, could be hashish, could be rat bones steeped in mint. Who knows? But if it made the pain go away, or at least made you forget where it hurt, it sold. One of the most infamous examples of medieval accidental high comes from something no one even realized was dangerous: ergot. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other grains. To a medieval baker, it just looked like a discolored seed. To a modern scientist, it looks like LSD's ugly cousin, a fungus that can induce hallucinations, convulsions, burning sensations, spontaneous dancing, and in extreme cases, gangrene. Yep, your limbs could rot and fall off. People didn't bake ergot bread on purpose, but in cold, damp areas like parts of France and Germany, it happened a lot. Whole villages were affected, dancing uncontrollably in the streets, laughing, screaming, crying sometimes, until death. Historians believe outbreaks of dancing mania or mass hysteria may have actually been mass ergot poisoning, but at the time they blamed it on demons or witches or bad morals. Classic. Some scholars even think ergot was involved in the Salem witch trials, with symptoms like seizures, hallucinations, and paranoia mimicking those of teenage girls exposed to ergot-tainted bread. Nothing confirmed, but definitely medieval. So by now, we've covered henbane, the herb that made you talk to trees; mandrake, the root that screamed and possibly cursed your dog; belladonna, the seductive poison that doubled as mascara; flying ointments applied in places we won't revisit; and ergot, the uninvited guest in your breakfast toast. But wait, there's more. Mad honey, incense highs, and the scent of divinity. Welcome back to the medieval journey you didn't know your nervous system needed. So far, we've sniffed mandrake, rubbed belladonna into questionable places, and discovered that some of Europe's weirdest visions were brought to you not by divine revelation, but by bad bread. But just when you think medieval mind-altering methods couldn't get more bizarre, we head east into the mountains of Anatolia, where even the bees were getting in on the action. Let's talk about mad honey. This isn't Winnie the Pooh's kind of snack. We're talking about a rare golden goo produced by bees who fed on rhododendron flowers' pretty pink blossoms that just so happen to contain gray anotoxins. Yeah, toxins. The kind that play with your nervous system like a bored cat with a mouse. When these bees do their thing in certain mountainous regions around the Black Sea, especially in modern-day Turkey, they produce what's known as mad honey, and it earns that name fast. Small doses, a gentle buzz, a warm wave. Maybe you see colors a little differently. Medium doses, nausea, dizziness, heart palpitations, larger doses. Time dilates. You meet your ancestors. You meet other people's ancestors. You fall into a trance, have visions, and maybe wake up next to a goat who now thinks you're its spiritual leader. And yes, this stuff wasn't just an accidental discovery. People knew. Locals would mix it into wine bread or simple spoonfuls to treat headaches, induce dreams, or just take the edge off medieval life, which, to be fair, had a lot of edges. Some traditional healers considered mad honey a sacred substance. Others saw it as recreational. It really depended on whether you used it for a spiritual ceremony or just because you were bored and hated your landlord. But here's the twist: mad honey was also a weapon. According to ancient and medieval sources, some Anatolian communities straight up poisoned invading armies with it. The trick was simple: leave jars of honey behind in empty villages. The hungry soldiers think they've hit the jackpot. Next thing you know, they're writhing on the ground, tripping over their own swords and wondering why the trees are whispering battle plans. The most famous case, the historian Xenophon records a story where Greek soldiers, during the retreat of the 10,000 in the 4th century BCE, consumed mad honey and ended up incapacitated for days. Locals knew the risk. Outsiders, not so much. And while that's technically pre-medieval, the honey's use persisted well into the Middle Ages in mystical rituals and folk medicine. Ambitious merchants even traded it in small clay pots, usually without dosage instructions, because who needs safety when your baseline treatment for a sore throat already involves crushed beetles and divine chanting? So, yes, in some corners of the world, even bees were accidental pharmacists. And as wild as that sounds, it wasn't even the most common mind-altering substance floating around medieval society. Let's take a breath literally and talk about incense. You know how you walk into a cathedral today and you're immediately hit with that deep, smoky, otherworldly scent. Well, that wasn't just for ambiance. Some of that stuff did things to your brain. Two of the biggest players, frankincense and myrrh, resinous substances burned in churches, temples, and royal courts. Imported from Arabia and East Africa, they were valued not just for their scent, but for their supposed spiritual and psychoactive effects. And here's what modern research shows: when burned, frankincense releases a compound called incensol acetate, which affects the limbic system in the brain. Translation: it can calm you, ease anxiety, and possibly induce mild euphoria. Now imagine this. You're a medieval monk. You've been fasting for days. You're dehydrated. You're chanting in a cold stone chapel for 6 hours while thick clouds of resin smoke fill the air around you. Suddenly, you feel light. You see halos. You swear you hear whispers of angelic choirs even though Brother Thomas just sneezed on you again. Were you experiencing a holy vision or just very, very high? Honestly, probably both. But it wasn't just Christian spaces where this happened. Incense was and still is a key part of spiritual practice around the world. In Buddhist temples, sandalwood and other sacred woods were burned during long meditation sessions. In Islamic mosques, sweet-smelling resins like oud were used to purify and bless the space. In Jewish synagogues, especially during ancient times, incense had ceremonial value tied to the temple in Jerusalem. And in pagan rites, incense was used not just to please the gods, but to open the mind, prepare for trance states, or just make a stinky cave smell a little less like wet wolf. Across all these traditions, burning incense was seen as a way to bridge the human and the divine, to elevate consciousness and invite sacred presence. Did people know it was chemically influencing their state of mind? Probably not, but they felt it. And sometimes that's all that matters. So, we've covered mad honey bee-produced chaos in a jar, incense, ancient aromatherapy, with a surprising neurological twist, and the strange truth that sometimes a monk's vision might owe just as much to smoke density as to divine presence. But alcohol, That's still a big one. And next time we're going there, because in the medieval world, beer wasn't a party drink. It was literally safer than water. Small beer, big buzz. How medieval people survived on booze. Welcome back, fellow time travelers. So far, we've rubbed hallucinogens into our thighs, eaten demon bread, sniffed ancient resin, and let bees hand us existential crises in a jar. But now it's time to talk about the one intoxicant that was everywhere, every class, every region, every meal, alcohol. Let's get one thing straight in the Middle Ages. Booze wasn't just a party favor, it was survival. We romanticize the past a lot, the castles, the knights, the epic romances. But you know what? People weren't romanticizing the water, because water. That stuff could kill you. Streams and wells were often contaminated with human waste, dead animals, or just the medieval version of don't ask, don't drink. Sanitation wasn't exactly a booming industry, so people turned to the one liquid that wouldn't give them dysentery with a side of regret fermented drinks. Enter small beer. This was the medieval version of your cousin's favorite La Croix light fizzy and vaguely questionable, but with alcohol. Small beer had a super low ABV alcohol by volume, usually around 1% to 2%. You weren't drinking it to get sloshed. You were drinking it because it was safer than a bucket of death water. It was brewed by boiling grains, adding yeast, and letting it ferment just long enough to kill harmful bacteria, but not so long that your peasant kid would start hearing colors. Speaking of kids, they drank it too. In fact, everyone did. Breakfast, small beer. Lunch, still small beer, feeling a bit sluggish at vespers. Guess what? And no, it didn't taste good. This wasn't craft brewery stuff. It was cloudy, a little sour, and often brewed in someone's basement by a woman named Edith, who measured ingredients by vibes and memory. But it worked. It kept people alive and mildly buzzed. Beer, as daily medicine monasteries, took things to another level. Monks were some of the most prolific and precise brewers in medieval Europe. Why? Because brewing beer was considered a sacred task, literally a holy chore. Monks weren't just throwing hops into cauldrons. They were documenting fermentation methods, testing recipes, even tweaking ingredients for seasonal flavor and medicinal effect. Beer was food, medicine, and spiritual support all in one foamy mug. In fact, during Lent, when monks weren't allowed to eat solid food, they often drank nutrient-rich beer instead. It was called liquid bread, and it kept them from starving during those long fasts. So while you're counting carbs in your modern Pilsner, just remember, medieval monks were chugging brews for Jesus. The upscale buzz mead and wine. If you were a little fancier, or at least not broke, you might indulge in mead. That's honey wine. Sweet, heavy, and made from fermented honey and water. Think of it as the medieval version of drinking something romantic and making questionable choices. Mead had its roots in ancient traditions and often carried mystical or ceremonial significance. Kings drank it. Warriors toasted with it. Witches might spike it with herbs. And poets, always the poets, swore it helped them hear the voices of the gods or at least rhyme better. Then there was wine, usually reserved for the wealthy, the religious elite, or people who had decent access to vineyards. It wasn't just for sipping at banquets either. Wine was mixed with herbs for medicinal purposes. Think spiced wine with poppy extract, or wine steeped with mandrake to calm pain or bring on visions depending on how many mugs you downed. And like everything in medieval Europe, the church had a say. Communion wine essential. Wine at dinner. Blessed, if not always understood. Some monasteries kept vineyards just for sacramental use. Others sold the excess to fund more sacred projects like you guessed it, building better breweries, the tavern medieval therapy with yelling now. Let's talk about where the real action happened, the medieval tavern. These weren't cozy gastro pubs with vegan shepherd's pie and trivia nights. They were loud, chaotic, and full of people trying to drink away the Black Death or their mother-in-law's extended visit. Taverns were the heart of social life gathering spots for workers, travelers, and gossip. Want to celebrate a wedding tavern? Want to mourn a death tavern? Want to escape the smell of your communal hut? You get it. Inside, you'd find wooden benches, tankards of ale, a suspiciously sticky floor, and at least one guy with stories about how he totally saw a dragon once. People drank to forget their troubles, bond with strangers, start bar fights, or invent new dance styles that nobody wanted, but everyone remembered. And taverns were egalitarian in a weird way. Rich or poor, you were going to get the same brew and probably the same splinters from the communal bench. Class didn't matter as much when everyone was tipsy and yelling about taxes. The medieval hangover, just part of life. Now, of course, not all alcohol was gentle. There were stronger ales, higher proof meads, and fortified wines that probably didn't come with a serving size. If you overdid it well, too bad. There were no greasy breakfasts or rehydration tablets. You just powered through your hangover with more bread, more chores, and maybe a herbal tea that made you hallucinate a solution to your tax debts. That's the thing about medieval drinking. It wasn't an event. It was part of the fabric of life. You were born, you were given small beer, you worked, you drank again, and you died. Hopefully not from moldy rye bread. So, to recap, medieval alcohol wasn't about excess, well, not always. It was survival. It was medicine. It was culture. And it was, ironically, the most consistent part of a world that barely understood germs, but deeply understood the power of a well-timed pint. Witchy rubs, oily hallucinations in edibles without chocolate. Welcome back, brave souls. So far, we've sipped our way through small beer, buzzed our heads with frankincense fumes, and uncovered the wild truth about bee-crafted chaos honey. But now we're stepping into a part of medieval life that might just make you look at your skincare routine a little differently. Because before modern edibles came in colorful packaging and tasted like watermelon, medieval people were already getting high, just not with chocolate or gummies or any sense of precision whatsoever. Nope. They used ointments, thick, pungent pastes packed with questionable herbs, whispered incantations and ingredients you definitely shouldn't rub on anything you care about. Let's break this down. The medieval transdermal trip. Today we have patches for nicotine hormone therapy and even motion sickness. The skin can absorb more than you think. And medieval folk, they figured that out a long time ago. They just applied the concept with slightly less science and way more pig fat. The logic went like this. If something made you feel better when you ate it, maybe it would work even better if you just rubbed it right into your skin. Thus was born a whole world of transdermal potions known back then as ointments, balms, unguents, or in some cases, stuff the village herbalist swore by, even though she hasn't blinked in 3 days. These ointments were made with henbane hallucinogen, mandrake hallucinogen with screaming tendencies, belladonna, vision-inducing poison, datura wildcard, and a base of animal fat, typically from pigs, cats, goats, or if you were particularly committed, a black rooster with a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. Why the fat? Because it was absorbent, sticky, and stayed on the skin long enough to deliver the payload. Also, it was what they had. The end result. You rub this unholy paste on your skin and wait, sometimes for hours. Then slowly, your world shifts. Maybe you feel lighter. Maybe you start floating, at least in your mind. Maybe you forget what your hands are for, and sometimes you just black out and wake up in a haystack with someone else's shoes on and a potato that insists it's your uncle. Flying ointments, revisited application, gets awkward. Now, if you remember our earlier broomstick chat, you know where this is going. These ointments, especially the ones associated with witches, had very specific instructions for application. And we're not talking elbows and knees. They were rubbed on mucous membranes, you know those membranes, inner thighs, armpits, genitals. In some accounts, even inside the nose or under the tongue. Why? Because these areas absorb substances more quickly, bypassing digestion and heading straight to the bloodstream. Even without a medical degree, medieval herbalists figured out that the skin could be a portal, and they leaned all the way in. That's where the broom comes back, not for sweeping, but for application. The staff was simply a tool to deliver the flying ointment exactly where it would be most effective. Was it PG? Not even close. Was it effective? Allegedly. Inquisition records are full of confessions describing flying feasting with the devil and attending midnight Sabbats in the nude. That doesn't just happen because someone had a weird dream. The other ointments, less flight, more fright. Not all ointments were for flying. Some were meant to ease pain during childbirth, though they also caused hallucinations, help with sleep by knocking you out cold, or act as aphrodisiacs, though, again, side effects included forgetting your name. These mixtures were often made by folk healers, midwives, and herbalists, many of whom were women operating in gray zones of authority. They knew plants. They knew their neighborhoods. They knew when someone needed calming and when someone needed to forget what happened at last week's town hall meeting. Their ingredients included henbane, again, always with the henbane, mandrake, nightshade berries, a splash of poppy, and occasionally hemlock, which is as friendly as it sounds. Sometimes these ointments also included personal touches, like saliva, menstrual blood ashes, or animal bones. Why? Symbolism, ritual, or maybe just bold vibes, intimate applications, and religious panic. It's worth noting that rubbing something into your bare skin in the Middle Ages wasn't just a physical act. It was spiritual. The skin was seen as the border between your soul and the outside world. So, an ointment that could pass through it, that wasn't just healing, it was inviting forces in. That's why the church was so suspicious of these practices. Sure, there was science kind of, and there was medicine sort of, but there was also the terrifying possibility that these people weren't just healing, they were communing with the wrong team. To a medieval priest, someone using a flying ointment wasn't just a woman rubbing herbs on her thighs. She was summoning spirits, inviting demons, and riding naked through the air to dance with Satan's catering crew. And if she claimed to have visions, to have flown, to have seen things, proof, witchcraft, burn her, the edibles of the era. Not every medieval trip came from skin rubbing. Many came from potions, wines, and tinctures, the closest thing they had to edibles. These weren't served in cute, gummy bear shapes or wrapped in parchment labeled Chill Out Blend. They were ladled out by candlelight into wooden cups and often tasted like boiled shoe mixed with regret. Common formats included spiced wine infused with poppy extract strong enough to make you forget your cousin's name, broths steeped with mandrake or belladonna, teas made from roots you absolutely shouldn't have made tea with. There were even traveling peddlers who sold these concoctions as universal cures. They promised everything: strength, youth, fertility, visions, wealth, and occasionally success in legal disputes. Basically, the medieval version of a late-night infomercial, except the host was just a sweaty guy on a mule. Did they work? Kind of. Sometimes. Mostly they just made you not care what your problem was anymore. The experience. What did it feel like? This is where it gets tricky. Medieval people didn't have words for tripping, buzzed, or high. They used terms like touched by the divine, overcome with spirits, or stricken with visions. And depending on your status, the same experience could mean wildly different things. A monk who hallucinated during a ritual potential saint. A peasant woman who saw the Virgin Mary in her bathtub witch. Burn her. Same symptoms, different fates. So let's sum up. Ointments were medieval edibles rubbed, not swallowed. Herbs and animal fat made up these trippy pastes. Applications were intimate and weird. The church was horrified. Users were mystics, healers, midwives, or dangerously curious peasants. Ergot, the demon, in the breadbasket. Welcome back to the foggy frontier of medieval consciousness. We've rubbed, sipped, sniffed, and spooned our way through everything from poppy wine to demon honey, but now we're stepping into something different, something darker, something that didn't just affect individuals, it infected entire villages. Let's talk about ergot, the parasitic fungus that turned breakfast into a psychedelic horror story. What is ergot? Ergot is a mold that grows on rye and other cereal grains, especially in damp, cool climates. To a medieval farmer or baker, it looked like a dark, shriveled grain, a bit off maybe, but not unusual enough to toss. After all, if your options are a little weird or starved to death, guess what's going in the oven? But here's what they didn't know. Ergot is loaded with alkaloids that affect the nervous system, ergotamine lysergic acid, and yes, chemical precursors to LSD. That's right. People were accidentally microdosing bread centuries before anyone in Silicon Valley tried it for productivity. Ergotism, the devil's double punch eating ergot-infected grain, could cause two different types of poisoning, both terrifying. 1. Convulsive ergotism, muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, crawling sensations under the skin, wild emotional swings, laughing fits, panic delusions. Victims described feeling bugs crawling on their flesh or being pulled by invisible forces. Some believed they were possessed or cursed by neighbors. And once that belief spread, you can guess what happened next. Witch hunts, forced exorcisms, and bad bread getting a very unfair reputation. 2. Gangrenous ergotism, blood vessel constriction, loss of circulation, numbness, blackened skin, tissue death, limbs falling off. Yes, falling off. This version of ergotism was especially cruel. People would watch their fingers, toes, even whole limbs wither and rot. It was called St. Anthony's fire because the burning sensation was unbearable. Monasteries dedicated to St. Anthony cared for the afflicted, offering spiritual support, warm beds, and most importantly, non-ergot-infested wheat. In other words, the treatment for St. Anthony's fire was different bread. The dancing plagues, when towns lost their minds. One of the most infamous symptoms of mass ergotism was choreomania, uncontrollable dancing, sometimes for days on end. Historical records from Germany, France, and the Low Countries describe outbreaks where dozens or hundreds of people began to dance wildly, unable to stop. They screamed, hallucinated, collapsed, sometimes died of exhaustion. The authorities didn't know what to do. Priests were called in. Bands were hired, yes, really. Some towns even built dancing platforms to try to contain the chaos. It wasn't joy, it was compulsion. At the time, people blamed it on demonic possession, divine punishment, or maybe the power of music itself. But modern historians believe many of these dancing plagues were actually caused by ergot-tainted bread. Poor harvest, rainy season, bad batch of rye, whole towns unknowingly dosed themselves, one bite at a time. The Salem witch trials. Ergot. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Some scholars believe ergot may have played a role in the Salem witch trials. In 1692, several girls began exhibiting strange behaviors, fits, hallucinations, screaming, convulsions. Sound familiar? They accused neighbors of bewitching them. People were imprisoned. 19 were hanged. One man was crushed with stones, all because of what started as inexplicable symptoms in a handful of girls. Could ergot have been in their bread? Maybe. The climate conditions were right, and rye was a dietary staple in colonial New England. It's still debated. But the theory has weight because the symptoms match, and it wouldn't be the first time people mistook a fungal neurotoxin for satanic influence. The cultural fallout. The thing about ergot is it didn't announce itself. There were no warning labels, no sniff test, just a slight bitterness, a slightly darker loaf. People ate it and then began to twist, scream, shake, or dance until their bodies gave out. And the cultural reaction was what you'd expect in a time of limited science and unlimited superstition. People were accused of witchcraft. Possessed individuals were beaten, burned, or prayed over. Villages turned on one another. And all the while, the real culprit was bread. But here's the kicker. Even when authorities began to suspect something was off with the grain, they didn't understand why. There was no germ theory, no fungal pathology, no microscope to point at the culprit. So what did they do? They prayed harder, burned more witches, and tried to bake bitter bread. Unintentional psychedelia, unlike flying ointments or poppy wine ergot, didn't require consent. You didn't seek it out. You didn't brew it carefully in candlelight. You just sat down for dinner, and suddenly you were seeing saint spiders or a neighbor's face melting into a candle, which raises an important distinction in medieval intoxication intent. If you chose to alter your mind, it was suspicious. If your mind was altered against your will, that was divine punishment or demonic or witchcraft. No one said maybe it was something in the food. That was too modern, too logical, too boring. So the supernatural got the blame, and the cycle continued. Let's review what you've just eaten or learned. Ergot grows on rye, especially in cool, wet climates. It can cause hallucinations, spasms, burning limbs, or limb death. It may have been responsible for dancing plagues and witch trials. It was the most widespread, least understood psychedelic of the medieval world, and people literally survived it by switching grains. Hashish, Sufi mystics, and the other side of medieval highs. Welcome back, explorers of the strange, the sacred, and the psychoactive. So far, we've tripped through ergot-infested, bread-smeared poisonous ointments into some very personal places and watched monks hallucinate in incense-thick cathedrals. But now we shift our gaze eastward into a part of the medieval world that approached intoxication with a very different philosophy. Tonight, we're talking about hashish, not the criminalized, whispered-about substance of modern headlines, but a historical, culturally embedded, sometimes spiritual tool used across the Islamic Golden Age. Let's dive into a world where getting high wasn't a sin. It was sometimes a shortcut to the divine. Hashish, what it is and what it was. Hashish comes from cannabis resin, concentrated, sticky, and potent. Unlike dried marijuana leaves, hash is more refined and more powerful. It was usually ingested, not smoked, and often mixed with honey herbs or spices into pastes, candies, or oils. And by the time Europe was accidentally dosing itself with moldy rye, the Islamic world had already been experimenting with hashish for centuries with surprising documentation. This wasn't an underground rave scene. This was poets, mystics, and scholars exploring consciousness on purpose with poetry and a solid grasp of dosage. The hashish eater's journey. Let's take a trip, figuratively, of course, into 10th century Persia. Imagine a quiet courtyard, a cup of honey-sweet hashish resting in your palm. You eat slowly, then wait. Soon the world bends slightly. Colors deepen. Sounds feel softer, more meaningful. You're not giggling uncontrollably. You're contemplating the cosmos, or maybe just the patterns in your rug. This was the hashish experience as described by users across the medieval Islamic world, not just for pleasure, but for revelation. Hashish and Sufism. Mysticism meets marijuana. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, embraced experiences that dissolved the ego and brought practitioners closer to divine truth. And for some Sufis, hashish was a tool, a means to step outside the mind, beyond rational thought, and into the oneness of all things. This wasn't recreational. It wasn't about forgetting pain or dancing with imaginary goats. It was about unraveling the self. Some Sufi texts describe hashish as the green key to the red heart, the herb of understanding, or the silence that speaks. And while not all Sufis agreed on its use, some abstained entirely. Many saw it as a sacrament, a helper, a guide. They didn't smoke it on street corners. They meditated with it. They wrote poetry with it. They sought God with it. Hashish and Islamic medicine. Hashish also found a home in the field of Islamic medicine. Physicians like Avicenna ibn Sina, one of the most influential medical thinkers of the Middle Ages, wrote about cannabis as a treatment for pain, inflammation, and various nervous conditions. It wasn't controversial. It was part of the medical toolkit, alongside opium, saffron, and leeches. In fact, hashish-infused remedies were recommended for muscle spasms, migraines, menstrual pain, and even melancholy. In some medical schools of the time, hashish was seen as calm in a bottle, or more accurately, calm in a date honey ball, which was a popular delivery method. And unlike the paranoia-laced reactions in Europe, Islamic scholars often approached hashish analytically. They studied its effects, documented experiences, and debated its ethical implications with nuance. Yes, it was also fun. Let's not get too sanctimonious, though. Hashish wasn't just for deep thoughts and spiritual awakening. It was also popular in cities, markets, and back rooms. In places like Cairo, Baghdad, and Isfahan, it was sold in hashish houses, social spaces where people could gather, eat, chat, and enjoy the green smoke or its sweet, edible cousins. There were jokes, there were songs, there were entire genres of hashish poetry praising its powers, mocking its excesses, or describing hilarious hallucinations in the most florid medieval Arabic you can imagine. A few gems translated loosely. I spoke with a melon, it spoke back. The curtain was breathing. I forgave it. My sandals demanded a divorce. I let them go. These weren't seen as demonic or depraved. They were just part of the tapestry, a reminder that the human impulse to get a little weird on a Tuesday is apparently eternal. The authorities step in. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. From time to time, Islamic rulers banned hashish, worried it led to laziness, decadence, or uncontrollable giggling during prayers. And to be fair, that last one is pretty disruptive. Some banned it outright, others taxed it heavily, still others turned a blind eye as long as things stayed quiet. But here's the crucial point. The response to hashish was not hysterical like in Europe. There were no burnings, no exorcisms, no accusations of goat flying. Instead, there were debates. Was hashish helpful or harmful? Did it open the heart or close the mind? Could it bring you closer to God or just to your couch? The answer was always depends on the user, and in that way the Islamic world had a surprisingly modern take on the substance. The Hashashin assassin, myths and mistranslations. You've probably heard of the Hashashin, the medieval assassins whose name allegedly comes from hashish. The story goes that they used the drug to enter trance states before murder missions. Except, it's probably a myth. The term Hashashin was used by outsiders often as a slur. The group itself, the Nizari Ismailis, were a secretive, politically active Shia sect. They may have used hashish occasionally, but most scholars agree the connection was exaggerated or invented entirely by their enemies to discredit them. Still, the image stuck the hashish-consuming assassin, knife in hand, eyes glazed with holy madness. It's cinematic, it's dramatic, but it's also probably fiction. So, what do we take away from this? Here's the contrast. In Europe, mind-altering substances were feared hidden or misunderstood. In the Islamic Golden Age, hashish was explored, recorded, debated, and in many circles respected. It wasn't a tool for rebellion. It was a tool for reflection. And the idea that a plant could soften the edges of the self, could help someone understand pain or pleasure or the divine that wasn't strange. It was in many ways sacred. The return trip. How Eastern highs changed Western minds. Welcome back. We've wandered the gardens of Sufi mystics, dined with bees on psychotropic honey, and been charmed by hashish poetry in candlelit courtyards. But now the story turns. Because what happens in one part of the world never really stays there, not in the medieval era, not when crusaders, pilgrims, and merchants are sailing back and forth with loot relics and very suspicious incense. In Part 8, we follow the trade routes, battle paths, and holy roads that carried Eastern intoxicants back into Europe, sometimes as medicine, sometimes as contraband, and often as mystery wrapped in moral panic. The Crusaders bring back more than just crosses. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, thousands of European crusaders marched into the Middle East to liberate the Holy Land. That's the official story. The unofficial story, they brought home all kinds of things they didn't fully understand. They saw cultures with advanced medicine, refined perfumes, and a far more casual relationship with psychoactive plants. Many crusaders returned with fragments of foreign languages. exotic herbs with unfamiliar effects, and stories. So many stories about mystics who could see visions, warriors who fought with eerie calm, and sorcerers who used smoke and oil to enter trances. They had no framework for this, so what did they do? They branded it magic, witchcraft, or in some cases, heresy. What they didn't realize was that they were bringing home early versions of the same substances they would later fear and persecute. Cannabis reaches Europe again. Cannabis wasn't new to Europe. Ancient Scythians used it. Some Greco-Roman texts mention it. But it wasn't widely used or understood. Then came the Islamic Golden Age, where hashish had flourished. As returning crusaders and merchants passed through Venice, Sicily, and Marseille, they brought small amounts of cannabis resin, often pressed into cakes or oils, and stories of its effects. At first, it was considered exotic medicinal, even fashionable among the elite. Apothecaries sold it in small doses for pain, sleep, and stomach troubles, but very quickly the tone shifted. By the 14th century, church authorities began clamping down, not because of solid scientific evidence, but because of moral fear. Anything that altered perception came from the East and wasn't already in a monastery's playbook was considered suspect. Hashish, along with opium and even strong incense, was increasingly seen as a gateway to sin. Opium medicine, miracle menace. Opium had a more complicated path. It was used in ancient Greece and Rome, but its refined medical use came back to Europe through Arab physicians and translated texts. Scholars like Avicenna ibn Sina wrote extensively about poppy-based pain treatments. By the 12th century, European apothecaries were crafting laudanum, an early opium tincture. Surgeons used it during battlefield amputations. Monks used it to calm convulsions. Midwives used it to numb childbirth pain. But again, it wasn't long before side effects caught up. Some patients became lethargic, others euphoric. Still others started talking to angels no one else could see. Enter the church once again with its deep skepticism of anything that made people too happy without Latin permission. Incense gets complicated. We've talked about frankincense and myrrh before, how their psychoactive properties likely contributed to mystical experiences. What we haven't touched on yet is how those substances made their commercial comeback through trade routes between Europe and the Islamic world. Medieval traders, especially in Italy, Spain, and Byzantium, brought back incense resins, perfumed oils, and herb blends used in both mosques and souks. The church loved the smell, but not the associations. Frankincense was allowed because it had biblical roots, but sandalwood, oud civet, musk. These were tied to other religions, so while the upper class burned them in private and some monasteries experimented with the effects, these scents were never fully embraced. And if someone reported visions after using them, well, that was either proof of sainthood or grounds for an inquisition. Depending on who you were and who was watching, the knowledge flowed both ways. It's easy to picture medieval Europe as simply absorbing Eastern influences, but the truth is, ideas moved in both directions. Islamic scholars debated the ethics of mind-altering substances long before Europe did. They categorized intoxication into helpful spiritual clarity permitted in some circles, dangerous loss of control condemned in many, and medicinal necessity accepted widely. European thinkers were slower to catch up, but by the 13th century, philosophers like Roger Bacon and Albertus Magnus began writing about the mind perception and the idea of chemical influence on the soul. Where did they get their ideas? Mostly from translated Arabic texts smuggled across borders, sometimes copied secretly in monasteries. A clash of frameworks. Here's the root of the issue. Eastern cultures, especially those influenced by Sufi, Persian, or Indian traditions, tended to see altered states as a part of reality, a different frequency on the divine radio. In contrast, Christian Europe believed altered states should come from God alone, no shortcuts, no herbs, no helpers. Anything else was cheating or worse, heresy. So, when European travelers brought back stories of men sitting in gardens, silent and smiling for hours. Poets, speaking of ego dissolution, doctors prescribing poppy and cannabis in tandem. Europe freaked out. Because these weren't just foreign substances, they were foreign ideas about the body, the mind, and the divine. A tale of two highs in the East. Hashish was a spiritual aid, a poetic muse, a companion in solitude. Opium was a painkiller, used carefully studied, openly. Incense was both scent and sacrament, a way to elevate the senses toward sacredness. In the West, those same substances were often seen as threats. They were misclassified, feared, and hidden unless wrapped in religious ritual and strict authority. This wasn't just about chemistry, it was about worldviews. Gods, blood, and mushrooms, ritual highs from Vikings to Aztecs. Welcome back, fellow mind explorers. You've traveled through the incense-thick halls of medieval monasteries, peeked into the hashish dens of the Islamic Golden Age, and watched ergot rot the legs off unsuspecting bakers. But now it's time to go global. Because while Europe and the Middle East were tiptoeing around intoxicants with incense and ointments, other civilizations weren't just experimenting, they were building entire religious systems around altered states. And the results, nothing short of cosmic. Let's begin with a group of people whose highs were less about poetry and more about battle rage. Vikings, berserkers, and the battle mushrooms. Let's get loud. You've probably heard of the berserkers, Viking warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, howling, foaming at the mouth, shrugging off sword wounds like mosquito bites. Ancient sources describe them as wearing the skins of beasts, possessed by Odin, and incapable of feeling pain. But what made them go berserk? Historians believe the answer might be Amanita muscaria, a red and white spotted mushroom found in Scandinavia. It's not the fun kind of edible. It's the deeply unpredictable kind. Effects include aggression, muscle spasms, superhuman energy, time distortion, and occasionally urinating into a horn and passing that around to recycle the active ingredients. Yes, that happened. To the berserkers, this wasn't a party drug, it was spiritual armor. They believed the mushroom helped them channel animal spirits, enter a sacred frenzy, and transcend fear. Not everyone survived the high, but that was the point. Pain, fear, identity, these were things to be burned off in battle, and the mushroom was their match. The Sami and reindeer urine. Before we leave the north, let's talk about the Sami people indigenous to parts of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Finland. They also used Amanita muscaria, but in a more spiritual shamanic context, not for war, but for vision. And here's the twist: they figured out that reindeer could eat the mushroom, metabolize the toxins, and then pee out a less poisonous version. So yes, Sami shamans would drink reindeer urine to get a cleaner, more manageable high. The result: hours of altered perception, rhythmic chanting, and conversations with ancestral spirits. Again, not a party, a ritual. Africa Iboga and the Bwiti religion. Now we fly south to Central Africa, where the Bwiti people of Gabon use a root bark called iboga in spiritual initiation ceremonies. Iboga is no mild trip. It's intense, profound, often terrifying. The Bwiti believe that by consuming iboga, the initiate will leave their body, speak to their ancestors, revisit their entire life in visions, and return reborn. This isn't recreational, it's rebirth through psycho-spiritual fire. You eat the bark, lie down, and wait, sometimes for 24 hours, sometimes longer. People often report vomiting, intense sweating, and wild visions before emerging with clarity, direction, and a sense of being deeply seen. Western researchers now study ibogaine, the active compound for treating addiction, but to the Bwiti iboga is sacred medicine, a plant not of this world, but a bridge to the one beyond. South America, ayahuasca, San Pedro, and the vine of the soul, now to the jungle. In the Amazon, multiple indigenous tribes prepare and drink ayahuasca, a thick, bitter brew made by combining two plants, one with DMT, a powerful hallucinogen, and one with MAO inhibitors that make it active orally. That's right. Ancient shamans figured out biochemical synergy long before modern pharmacology. Ayahuasca isn't for fun, it's for healing, purging, and revelation. Users report meeting cosmic beings, re-experiencing childhood traumas, vomiting out darkness they didn't know they were carrying, and emerging changed. It's often described as 10 years of therapy in one night. If the therapist were a snake, or the room were on fire, and your ego was being disassembled molecule by molecule. The rituals involve music, chants, silence, and sometimes darkness. The goal is not just visions, but wisdom. Meanwhile, in the Andes, another plant held sway, San Pedro cactus, also known as huachuma. Containing mescaline, it produced gentler, longer-lasting effects, waves of emotion, open-heartedness, and deep reflection. Practitioners described feeling one with the mountains, in communion with animals, and called to forgive their enemies. Different from ayahuasca's chaos, less fire, more light. North America peyote and the spirit world among indigenous peoples of North America, especially in the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico. Peyote has been used for centuries. This small cactus contains mescaline, like San Pedro, but with a slightly different tone, more introspective, more cosmic math. Peyote ceremonies are deeply structured, guided by elders, and often involve all-night chanting, drum circles, sacred fires, and long, silent periods of prayer. Peyote isn't about escape, it's about seeing clearly, about sitting with the truth, however hard, however beautiful. In the 20th century, this tradition became the foundation of the Native American Church, a syncretic religion blending Christianity and indigenous ritual, legally protecting peyote use for spiritual purposes. So, yes, in parts of the U.S., psychedelics are constitutionally protected as a religious sacrament. Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, and the flesh of the gods. And now, we arrive in the land of the Aztecs. They used psilocybe mushrooms, yep, magic mushrooms, as part of religious festivals. The Aztec name for these fungi was Teonanacatl, meaning flesh of the gods. That's not metaphorical. These mushrooms were eaten by priests, nobles, and even sacrificial victims to dissolve fear, heighten awareness, and enter communion with the divine. Rituals included dance, music, bloodletting, and elaborate ceremonies beneath the stars. One Spanish priest watching these rituals wrote, "They ate these mushrooms and lost their reason, and spoke to demons." But the Aztecs believed they were speaking to God's ancestors and cosmic forces far beyond human understanding. And just like that, we see the same pattern again. One culture's sacrament is another's heresy. One tribe's healer is another army's witch. Summary: the world was already tripping. Long before the modern psychedelic renaissance, the world was already experimenting with purpose, with reverence, and with structure. What separated these rituals from drug use was context, ceremony, intention, elders guiding the experience, community support for the integration afterward. These weren't isolated buzzes. They were portals, witches, alchemists, and the last echoes of the old highs. Welcome back. You've danced with Aztec gods on mushroom-laced altars, listened to reindeer urine shamans in the Arctic, and survived Viking mushroom battles. But now we return to familiar soil, late medieval Europe, where intoxication, mysticism, and medicine collide in one final crescendo before the Enlightenment dims the candlelight. In Part 10, we explore the secret knowledge keepers, witches, alchemists, midwives, and folk healers. These weren't cartoon villains. They were the last echoes of the ancient ways, guardians of plant knowledge, trance, and ritual in a world that was fast replacing mystery with microscope. Let's dive in. Witches and the plant lore of power. Let's clear something up right away. The word witch in the medieval period didn't always mean what you think. Long before the broomsticks and devil horns, witches were often simply women with knowledge of herbs, childbirth, weather, and human suffering. They brewed teas from valerian to calm the nerves. They used yarrow for wounds. They prescribed poppy-infused broths for labor pain And yes, some knew how to make flying ointments from belladonna mandrake and henbane. These weren't party favors. They were tools for trance, for spiritual journeying, for facing death. But as the church tightened its grip, this sacred knowledge became dangerous. Suddenly, rubbing a balm on your skin was no longer folk medicine, it was consorting with demons. A tea for grief became a satanic potion, and the midwife helping a birth, a witch in disguise. What changed? Not the herbs, just the narrative. The Witch Hunts Drug Panic Medieval Edition. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe erupted in one of the most tragic paranoid mass delusions in history, the witch hunts. Tens of thousands, mostly women, were accused, tortured, and executed. But here's what the records show when you look closely. Many confessed to flying through the night. Many described visions of animal spirits or devils. Some admitted to applying ointments, drinking potions, or entering trances. These weren't delusions. These were the symptoms of plant-based psychedelics described through the only lens the accused had: religion. Witches didn't call it tripping. They said they spoke with spirits or danced with the moon. And under torture, those poetic metaphors turned into lethal confessions. Alchemists and the spiritual chemistry of intoxication. While witches worked with roots and oils, alchemists approached intoxication from a different angle: transmutation. Alchemy wasn't just about gold. It was about the soul, turning base matter into pure spirit. And sometimes that meant ingesting strange substances and sacred rituals to alter the mind and commune with higher forces. They experimented with sulfur, mercury, alcoholic tinctures, and even early distillations of ethanol, a form of spiritual essence. To alchemists like Paracelsus, alcohol was the fifth element, the spiritus, the carrier of hidden truth. He once said, "What is poison? Everything is poison. It is only the dose that makes a thing not a poison." This idea, dose matters, was revolutionary. It foreshadowed modern pharmacology, psychedelic therapy, and the entire concept of harm reduction. To the church, these experiments were blasphemous, but to the alchemists, it was divine surgery of the soul. Midwives and secret psychoactive practices. Midwives stood at the intersection of life and death. They saw more births and more stillbirths than any priest or scholar, and with them came a powerful toolkit of plant knowledge, much of which is now forgotten. During childbirth, midwives often used poppy to reduce pain, mugwort to ease labor, ergot, yes, that ergot to induce contractions. They also prepared ritual baths, binding chants and protective charms, a blend of medicine, spirituality, and paternal care. But again, context mattered. In a village, she was a healer. In a courtroom, she was a witch. Midwives who practiced herbal pain relief were often accused of stealing life from God. If they saved a baby, it was a miracle. If they lost one, it was sorcery. The line was razor thin. Folk magic, the last legal trip. Even as witch trials raged, folk magic remained a tolerated gray area in many rural communities. People believed in love potions made with rose and nutmeg, protective sachets filled with sage thyme and lavender, dream teas that could summon ancestors. Most of this wasn't about getting high, but about altering reality, even slightly, feeling calmer, seeing clearer, connecting deeper. The intent wasn't escape, it was alignment. Science begins to take over. By the late 1600s, science began replacing superstition, which sounds like progress, until you realize that emotion, intuition, and lived experience got pushed out in the process. Herbs became chemical compounds. Spirits became neurotransmitters. Dreams became delusions. The old ways, witchcraft, alchemy, midwifery, were labeled irrational, feminine, and dangerous. They were replaced by male-led institutional medicine that was powerful, yes, but often blind to subtlety. And while this shift saved lives, it also erased centuries of wisdom about how plants could shape perception, not just biologically, but emotionally. spiritually, ritually. The underground never died. But here's the twist. The knowledge didn't vanish. It just went underground, hidden in folk tales, garden recipes, whispered traditions, and yes, old women who still kept jars of dried herbs and knew when to stir, how to brew, and what not to say out loud. And today, as science rediscovers the power of psilocybin, ayahuasca, and cannabis, we realize these new tools are old friends. The Enlightenment's war on ecstasy, from sacred vision to mental illness. Welcome back. We've tiptoed through the torchlit shadows of witches' gardens and alchemists' labs. We've seen hallucinations treated as visions and mushrooms worshipped as the flesh of gods. But now, in part 11, we arrive at the turning point. This is the chapter where ecstasy becomes madness, where mystical experiences are stripped of meaning, and where the world's ancient knowledge of trance spirit and altered consciousness is replaced with something colder. Institutions, diagnoses, chains. This is the Enlightenment, not the kind with divine light pouring from the heavens, but the one powered by gas lamps, microscopes, and prison walls. The Enlightenment arrives and brings its baggage. The 17th and 18th centuries were a time of incredible scientific progress. Isaac Newton explained the stars. Galileo pointed his telescope at the moon. Descartes split the mind from the body, and doctors began to wear white. Sounds promising, right? But this new scientific worldview came with a cost. The spiritual, emotional, and intuitive dimensions of human experience were flattened. Visions were now hallucinations. Trances were nervous fits. Mystical states became hysteria. And anything induced by herbs, mushrooms, or ritual, well, that was just madness by ingestion. The rise of the asylum. Here's where it gets darker. As institutions grew, so did the asylum system. Originally places of care, these quickly became warehouses for people who didn't fit the mold of rational, linear Enlightenment thinking. The inmates included women with postpartum depression diagnosed as melancholia, epileptics, people grieving too loudly, and yes, people who had mystical or altered state experiences without the right context. Before, they might have been called seers, mystics, or chosen ones. Now, lunatics. One French doctor even wrote that anyone who heard voices from heaven should be immediately restrained as they were under the influence of poisonous vapors or demonic delusion. The idea that someone could see something real in a non-ordinary state became dangerous not to the patient, but to the system. The criminalization of pleasure. As the Enlightenment marched on, intoxication lost its holiness. Substances like cannabis, used in medicine and ritual for centuries, opium, once sold openly in apothecaries, and even alcoholic tinctures used by monks were reclassified as vices, signs of moral failure, or outright crimes. The pleasure they brought, once celebrated in poetry, mysticism, and ritual, was now suspect. Because in the Enlightenment worldview, the body must obey reason, pleasure must be controlled, and the mind, it must stay within the lines. So if a person laughed too hard without reason, we called it mania. If they saw beauty where others saw walls, we called it psychosis. If they cried at night from a vision of their dead mother, we called it madness. In short, if you felt too deeply, you were ill. Women in the crosshairs. No group suffered more under this shift than women. Throughout the medieval period, women had been herbalists, midwives, mystics, and medicine keepers. But in the Enlightenment, they were reclassified. Their emotions were unbalanced. Their rituals were superstition. Their knowledge, dangerous nonsense. The result, a tidal wave of new diagnoses, especially for hysteria, a catch-all term for when a woman felt too much, wanted too much, or simply refused to smile on command. Doctors prescribed everything from rest cures to ice baths to forced institutionalization. Some of these women may have simply been depressed, grieving, or more provocatively tapping into the same altered states that saints, monks, and shamans once sought on purpose. Now they were locked away for it. Madness becomes a career path. By the 1800s, a new professional class emerged, the alienist, what we now call the psychiatrist, and their job to sort the sane from the insane. Suddenly, you had a system where a person could be observed, diagnosed, restrained, and medicated, all without ever being listened to. It wasn't about the why behind their visions, voices, or rituals. It was about how fast they could be made to stop. Many early psychiatric texts describe patients who claimed to speak to the stars, heard trees whispering secrets, or danced alone under the moon. They were institutionalized, sometimes, for life. But in other centuries, in other cultures, these same behaviors would have been honored, guided, or celebrated. Science versus spirit. The false binary. One of the greatest tragedies of this era was the false war between science and spirit. Instead of integrating scientific method with ancient wisdom, chemical knowledge with ritual experience, rationality with feeling, Western society chose a side, and it chose to erase centuries of spiritual plant work, shamanic tradition, and emotional depth in the name of objectivity. We began asking, what's the molecule not? What's the meaning? We dissected the brain, but forgot the soul. Not everyone forgot, yet even in this cold new world, some remembered. Artists and poets like William Blake, Samuel Taylor, Coleridge, Hello, Opium, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, all explored altered states through writing, imagination, and yes, chemical assistance. They didn't call themselves shamans, but their works often hinted at other worlds, thin veils, and forbidden knowledge. Even science had its rebels like Mesmer, who dabbled in trance, or Freud, who explored cocaine and dreams. They kept the flame alive even as the walls of reason grew taller. Summary: the sacred was medicalized. So let's recap what the Enlightenment did to the ancient high. Vision became illness, ecstasy became madness, plant medicine became criminal substance, and the mystic became the inmate. It wasn't that people stopped feeling deeply, it's that the culture no longer knew what to do with those feelings. And so we institutionalized the soul. The chemical wars, opium, heroin, and the battle for the soul. Welcome back. The Enlightenment gave us precision logic and medicine, but it also gave us cold institutions, misdiagnosed visions, and a world terrified of the irrational. And yet, some highs are too powerful to suppress. In Part 12, we enter the industrial age, where science doesn't just study the old substances, it refines them, markets them, and eventually criminalizes them. This is the story of opium's evolution into morphine, then heroin, and eventually the war on drugs. A war not just on substances, but on consciousness itself. Let's begin. Opium, the world's favorite painkiller. Opium had been around for millennia. We've seen it in Greek temples, Roman kitchens, and Sufi clinics. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, opium had become something bigger. Thanks to trade routes, empire building, and colonization, it was now global business. The British Empire in particular leaned hard into the opium trade, growing poppies in India and selling them to China in exchange for tea. The result, millions became addicted. China pushed back. Britain responded with force. This led to the infamous Opium Wars, literal wars, fought over the right to sell drugs. The irony: the same empire that moralized about vice was now funding its navy with narcotic profits. Meanwhile, back in Europe, opium was sold openly, widely in pharmacies, general stores, even children's teething syrup. It was the aspirin of its day, calming, effective, and everywhere. Morphine, the scientific high. In the early 1800s, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner isolated the active compound in opium and named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was the first time in history a plant spirit had been turned into a molecule. Morphine was potent, precise in dosage, and considered modern medicine It became a staple in battlefield medicine, especially during the American Civil War, where thousands of soldiers were given morphine for amputations, gunshot wounds, and shell shock. The side effect, an epidemic of what they called soldier's disease, aka morphine addiction. And still doctors handed it out like candy because it worked, and because they hadn't yet understood that refining a plant also concentrates its shadow. Heroin, the safe alternative. By the late 1800s, morphine addiction was becoming visible, so pharmaceutical companies, most notably Bayer, searched for a less addictive alternative. What they invented was diacetylmorphine, a morphine derivative they branded as heroin. That's right. Heroin began as a legal over-the-counter cough syrup marketed as non-addictive, safe for children, and ideal for those recovering from morphine dependence. Spoiler, it wasn't. Heroin turned out to be even more addictive than morphine, and by the early 20th century, governments began to panic. What followed was a pendulum swing from unregulated euphoria to rigid prohibition. And for the first time in modern history, being high became a crime. The birth of the war on drugs. In the early 1900s, countries began cracking down. The Harrison Narcotics Act 1914 in the U.S. regulated opiates and cocaine. The League of Nations began forming international treaties. Addiction became associated not with illness, but with moral failure. Suddenly, drugs weren't tools, medicine, or sacraments. They were threats. And those who used them, criminals, deviants, undesirables. And so began the slow erosion of nuance, addiction, and the erasure of context. One of the great tragedies of this period is how addiction was separated from meaning. Before, a person who overindulged in opium might be seen as lost in grief, spiritually disoriented, or suffering from existential despair. Now they were sick, dangerous, or weak. No more context, just labels. A factory worker popping laudanum to survive a 14-hour shift, addict. A widow drinking morphine to dull the pain of loss, addict. A mystic using hashish to commune with the divine, addict. And while science focused on dosage and withdrawal society, forgot to ask, what were these people running from or toward? Race, class, and drug hysteria. Let's not pretend the war on drugs was ever neutral. In the early 20th century, opium became associated with Chinese immigrants, cocaine with Black Americans, marijuana with Mexican laborers. And each wave of regulation came with a wave of racialized fear. The Chinese opium dens will seduce your daughters. Cocaine makes black men immune to bullets. Marijuana turns immigrants into lunatics. None of it was true. But fear worked, and laws followed. Soon, entire communities were targeted not for the effects of the substance, but for the identity of the user. Medicine turns its back. As prohibition took root, even medical uses were thrown into doubt. Doctors feared losing their licenses. Researchers abandoned psychedelic and narcotic studies. Ancient plant medicines were locked away. Opium, once sacred, was now filth. Morphine, once miraculous, was restricted. Heroin, once medicinal, was outlawed. Even cannabis, used for thousands of years, was smeared by propaganda and banned globally by mid-century. We had reduced the history of human intoxication to a crime sheet. The high becomes the enemy. By the 1950s and 60s, any form of altered consciousness that wasn't alcohol or caffeine was viewed with suspicion. You could drink yourself senseless, chain smoke cigarettes, pop sleeping pills, but talk to God on mushrooms. That was insanity. Seek healing through a plant. That was criminal. Feel too deeply, too vividly, or too differently. That was pathology. And so for a time, the door to transcendence closed. Not because the substances disappeared, but because the culture forgot how to use them. LSD Leary and the psychedelic resurrection. Welcome back. We've marched through the ages from honey-drunk Sufis to heroin-laced cough syrups. We've watched mystics become patients and patients become criminals. But in Part 13, something unexpected happens. The pendulum swings. because no repression lasts forever. And by the 1960s, a new generation was ready to reopen the doors of perception with chemistry rebellion and just a dash of cosmic mischief. This is the era of LSD Timothy Leary and the psychedelic counterculture, a chaotic renaissance where the ancient dream of spiritual intoxication made a thunderous return right into the jaws of modern law. Let's dive in. The accidental alchemist Albert Hofmann and LSD-25. In 1938, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, working at Sandoz Laboratories, synthesized a new compound derived from ergot, that infamous fungus we met back in the medieval rye fields. He called it lysergic acid diethylamide 25, or LSD-25. It sat on the shelf for 5 years, until Hofmann decided to revisit it. In 1943, while handling it, he accidentally absorbed a small amount through his fingertips. What followed was history's first intentional acid trip. He rode his bicycle home, and on the way, the trees breathed, the sky pulsed, reality bent inward. He had no words for it, only awe. LSD had unlocked a radical new dimension of consciousness, from psychiatry to counterculture. In the 1950s, psychiatrists and therapists experimented with LSD as a tool for treating depression and anxiety, helping alcoholics, reaching traumatic memories, and even facilitating spiritual experiences. It wasn't fringe science. Major institutions like Harvard, UCLA, and the CIA will get to that conducted research. Psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. He gave Aldous Huxley his first dose of mescaline, which inspired Huxley's classic book, The Doors of Perception. For a while, psychedelics were respected as tools to explore the mind's depths, much like ancient shamans once used ayahuasca or peyote. But then came a man who didn't just want to study LSD, he wanted to set it free. Timothy Leary, the psychedelic evangelist. Timothy Leary was a Harvard psychologist who believed LSD could revolutionize human consciousness. His motto, turn on, tune in, drop out. He saw psychedelics not just as medicine, but as awakening a way to peel off the false layers of modern life capitalism, conformity, and fear. Leary held group LSD sessions with students and intellectuals, founded the League for Spiritual Discovery, yes, a religion built around LSD, told people to drop out of society's lies and build a new world from within. To his fans, he was a prophet. To the government, he was a threat. Psychedelics hit the streets. By the mid-60s, LSD wasn't just in labs, it was in parks, concerts, and communes. Artists, musicians, and seekers used it to write lyrics, paint visions, heal traumas, or simply see the universe breathe. Bands like the Beatles, the Grateful Dead, and Pink Floyd infused their art with LSD's kaleidoscopic energy. The Summer of Love in 1967 was a psychedelic eruption. Thousands gathered in San Francisco, tripping on acid and dreaming of peace, freedom, and unity. And for a moment, it felt possible. But behind the love beads and paisley shirts, powerful forces were watching. The backlash begins. As LSD spread, so did the panic. Media stories claimed it caused insanity, suicide, even permanent brain damage. Politicians warned of a generation escaping reality. Parents feared their children were being lost to the void. And then came Charles Manson, a cult leader whose crimes were grotesque and whose followers had used LSD. The connection was tenuous, but it was enough. In 1968, the U.S. banned LSD. By 1970, it was a Schedule I drug considered to have no medical use and high potential for abuse on par with heroin. And just like that, the door slammed shut again. The CIA's secret trips MK Ultra. Here's the part most history books skip. While hippies were taking LSD in Golden Gate Park, the CIA was dosing people without their knowledge as part of MK Ultra, a secret mind control project. They gave LSD to soldiers, prisoners, prostitutes, and even unsuspecting civilians. They wanted to see if it could break minds, create truth serums, or forced confessions. What they found instead was chaos. People had terrifying experiences. Some never recovered. Others were gaslit into believing it never happened. The irony, while public LSD use was criminalized, government agencies were using it behind closed doors. The science that never finished. Before the ban, LSD showed promise in reducing alcoholism, helping terminal patients face death without fear, and even curing PTSD. But when the law changed, most studies stopped. Millions who might have been helped weren't. Thousands of years of sacred plant work, and now modern pharmacology had rediscovered the wheel, then locked it in a closet. LSD and the inner landscape. For those who used it responsibly, LSD offered insight, emotional catharsis, creative explosion, or spiritual awakening. Like the mushrooms of the Aztecs, the hashish of the Sufis, or the reindeer urine of the Sami, LSD was a portal. But without ritual intention or guidance, it became chaotic. That was the tragedy of the psychedelic 60s. Too much freedom, not enough framework. Too many visions, not enough integration. And a culture that went from reverence to resistance to repression. But the flame never died. Even after the bans, the spark remained. Underground therapists kept working quietly. Indigenous groups protected their ceremonies. Writers like Terence McKenna kept the philosophy alive. And curious minds kept asking, what did we lose when we criminalized consciousness? The answer, a lot. The modern psychedelic renaissance, healing science and spirituality, reunited. Welcome back. After decades of repression, misinformation, and cultural fear, the story of altered states is coming full circle. In Part 14, we witness the rebirth of psychedelics not as counterculture symbols or taboo substances, but as tools of healing science and spiritual growth. The ancient wisdom we've explored from Sufi hashish to Aztec mushrooms has inspired a modern renaissance. This isn't about escapism or rebellion. It's about restoring connection to self, others, and the mystery of life. Let's explore. Psychedelic science returns. Starting in the 1990s and accelerating into the 21st century, universities and medical centers reopened doors long shut. Research now shows that substances like psilocybin magic mushrooms, MDMA ecstasy, LSD, ayahuasca, and ketamine can provide dramatic relief for depression, PTSD, anxiety, addiction, and existential distress. Studies at institutions like Johns Hopkins Imperial College London and Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies MAPS use modern tools, brain scans, controlled trials, psychological assessments to prove what shamans have known for millennia. Altered states can heal. Integration of science and spirit. What makes this renaissance unique is the blend of ancient ritual and modern medicine. Therapists incorporate mindfulness and meditation, guided journeys, safe supportive settings, and sometimes ceremonial music and environment. The goal, not just to induce a trip, but to create a transformational experience, one that changes how people relate to trauma, fear, and themselves. This echoes the shamanic wisdom of framing the psychedelic experience as sacred, meaningful, and guided. Decriminalization and legal change. The cultural shift is real. Cities like Denver, Oakland, and Seattle have decriminalized psilocybin. Countries like Canada, Portugal, and the Netherlands offer legal or compassionate access. States like Oregon have established medical frameworks for psychedelic therapy. The tide is turning from criminalization to compassionate care. The return of the plant teachers, simultaneously, indigenous voices are reclaiming their rightful place as guardians of these sacred medicines. Traditional ayahuasca ceremonies in the Amazon attract seekers worldwide, but these ceremonies now stress respect for tradition, environmental protection, and cultural integrity. The global community is slowly realizing that the old ways have lessons modern science is only beginning to understand. Challenges and cautions. The Renaissance isn't without pitfalls. Commercialization risks commodifying sacred plants. Psychedelic tourism can exploit vulnerable communities. Scientific research must remain rigorous and ethical. Not everyone responds well. Set setting and intention matter deeply. But with care, the modern use of psychedelics holds promise to heal wounds older than history itself, a new chapter in human consciousness. Ultimately, this renaissance is more than medicine. It's a call to rediscover mystery in a world obsessed with certainty. Embrace depth in a culture fixated on surface. Heal the fractured self through communion with the vast unknown. It's the ancient dream reborn, the eternal quest, healing expansion, and the path forward. Here we are, the final part of our journey through the tangled history of altered states, ancient rituals, and the evolving relationship between humanity and the substances that open our minds. From mushroom-fueled Aztec ceremonies to medieval herbal brews, from the darkness of the Enlightenment's prisons to the bright promise of today's psychedelic renaissance, the story is the same. Humanity has always sought to transcend itself. The universal drive. Why do we chase altered states? Because in some way, every culture, every era has understood this truth. Our ordinary senses only show us a fraction of reality. There's more mystery, more connection, more meaning. And plants, fungi, and substances have long been our guides into that deeper reality. Healing wounds, old and new today. As science confirms what shamans and mystics, new psychedelics offer more than trips, they offer healing. Healing from trauma, isolation, depression. Healing from disconnection within ourselves, with each other, and with nature. This healing is not a magic pill, but a journey, one that asks us to confront darkness and emerge changed. Integration, the key to wisdom. Ancient cultures always paired these substances with ritual, community, and integration. The modern world is rediscovering this essential truth. True transformation doesn't come just from the substance, but from how we hold the experience, how we learn from it, and how we carry it forward. Your path forward. Whether you're curious, cautious, or committed, remember, this is a personal journey. Respect the medicines. Respect the traditions. Respect your own mind and body. Seek guidance, community, and education. Because these ancient teachers, whether they come as mushrooms, roots, or molecules, are powerful. And with power comes responsibility. A final reflection. This story isn't just about plants or chemicals. It's about humanity's eternal quest to understand itself and its place in the cosmos. Through fear, wonder, persecution, and celebration, we've kept reaching out, and so will you. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through history, science, and spirit. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where do you see this story heading next? How has your own experience shaped your view of these ancient medicines? Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep expanding.